This morning, Secretary of State Tony Blinken is in Jordan for a gathering of leaders focused on getting more aid into Gaza. Earlier, he was in Israel, meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Blinken telling reporters this morning that there is consensus among Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders to move forward on a proposed ceasefire deal that was approved by the UN Security Council yesterday. Blinken also saying it all now comes down to Hamas.
We await the answer from Hamas, and that will speak volumes about what they want, what they're looking for, who they're looking after. Are they looking after one guy who may be, for now, safe, buried, 10 stories underground somewhere in Gaza, while the people that he purports to represent continue to suffer in a crossfire of his own making? Or will he do what's necessary to actually move this to a better place, to help end the suffering of people, to help bring real security to Israelis and Palestinians alike?
That one guy that Secretary Blinken is referring to is Hamas military leader Yahya Sinwar. And there is new reporting in the Wall Street Journal about messages purportedly from Sinwar to ceasefire negotiators. One message reading, "We have the Israelis right where we want them." Joining us right now is retired Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. He was the spokesperson for the IDF before and after the October 7th attack. We had him on many a time. He's now a senior fellow with the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. Colonel, thank you so much for being here. I want to get to that reporting from the Wall Street Journal with some additional context in just a second. But first on what we hear from Secretary Blinken, meeting with Netanyahu. And he also not only said there was consensus, he said that Netanyahu reaffirmed his commitment in support of this hostage and ceasefire deal as it's laid out so far. Do you think they are closer than ever before to an actual deal? We've seen steps forward and then, how do you read this?
I sadly don't, and I'm not as positive towards the whole development. I would love to see our hostages home, our 120 hostages home, and I would want to see Israel defeat Hamas and return safety to southern Israel and improve the situation in Gaza. But I think that Yahya Sinwar is, in his text messages, he hits the nail on the head, sadly, and for months Hamas has been manipulating global public opinion, using international politics, the differences between Washington and Jerusalem, and they have basically been able to stay alive and stay out of jail using the hostages for about 3, 4, 5 months. And that's something that I think is the core of Hamas' strategy, to delay and delay as much as possible using the hostages and kind of try to derail Israeli operations in Gaza so that the war will end without Israel defeating Hamas. That's the zero-sum game, and I think that Sinwar doesn't really have a strong incentive to go ahead and release hostages and basically end the war, because that is his best tool to stay alive and to keep Hamas in power in Gaza.
Let me ask you about that. So the Wall Street Journal reporting, CNN has not seen the Wall Street Journal the messages that the Wall Street Journal is reporting on, cannot confirm the authenticity of them. Still, I want to read some more of the reporting from the Journal. "We have the Israelis right where we want them." We read it was one message. And these are messages to the negotiators to the ceasefire negotiators,
yes,
is what this is. And this is another one. In one message to Hamas leaders in Doha, Sinwar cited civilian losses in national liberation conflicts in places such as Algeria, where hundreds of thousands of people died fighting for independence from France, saying, quote, "These are necessary sacrifices." Here's the thing. If this is the case, if this is the zero-sum game that you're talking about, if this is the strategy, how does Israel take on Hamas, take out Hamas, deal with Sinwar without playing into his hands?
That's a good question, and I think that the Israeli strategy has been so far to try to get to Sinwar, get to the senior leadership of Hamas, so far not succeeding, probably because he is hidden underground with lots of Israeli hostages surrounding him as human shields. And so far what Israel sadly hasn't been able to do is to advance fast enough and to get to Sinwar and basically decide the battle. It took Israel many months of staging in order to finally get into Rafah. There was tremendous outcry, and there were protest that Israel shouldn't and mustn't go into Rafah. Israel is in Rafah, and there's no humanitarian catastrophe, and there's no mass casualty event, which proves that Israel can and should do what it's doing.
There is a humanitarian crisis throughout Gaza, though.
Definitely,
you know
yes,
that.
but I'm talking that there's not a slaughter, not a catastrophe like people warned that there would be.
Do you think some have thought, hoped, maybe conjectured that the rescue operation from the weekend could have changed the calculus? They're getting 3 men out, men that were not supposed to be in the first batch of any ceasefire negotiation, getting those hostages out. Do you think that changes the calculations you're discussing for Hamas? Do you think that could scare them to the table?
It's a very happy event, but eventually it only proves that I think it strengthens the case of getting hostages out via negotiations, because I don't think that Israel has the intelligence capacity or the otherwise military capacity to get more hostages out like this, because this was a top-of-the-shelf special operations with weeks of preparation, intel, tip-of-the-spear Israeli commando units that got in, got the job done, got the hostages out, and I don't think that we'll sadly have the ability to do so over and over again. And I don't think that it changes the calculation, and I think that Iran, Hezbollah are a much bigger threat. You know, we're focused on Gaza and small details in Gaza. The big deal and the big threat to regional stability is Hezbollah against Israel. And if you look at where alarms are sounding most in Israel, it's in northern Israel, and it's rockets and drones, etc.
Well, and sadly, when you're talking about where Israel is situated, it's all big crises. It's all big alarms that are sounding.
It is.
From Hamas in Gaza to the neighbors around, with funded and supplied and supported by Iran. In terms of the motivation and position of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Blinken says that he reaffirms his support for a deal today. But President Biden told Time magazine in a very recent interview, and here's how he put it: there is every reason for people to draw the conclusion that Netanyahu is prolonging the war for his own political gain. What's your reaction to that?
As an Israeli, as a father to children who will soon be serving in the military, I really, really hope that isn't true. And I would like to see evidence that states the otherwise from my elected leadership. I think it's very important, and what we lack now in Israel is unity and trust. We are, as you rightly said, surrounded by so many enemies that are challenging our very existence. And what the Israeli public now is going through, there's battle fatigue, 8 months of fighting, relentless alarms and sirens, and 100,000 people are evacuated from their homes in northern Israel. And the war goes on. We had 4 casualties reported just this morning. Lots of pressure on Israeli society, and what's desperately needed is unity, is leadership, and is to carry Israel forward in what I think will be the coming years, not months. The coming years will be very challenging.
You don't think President Biden was so off base to say that?
I don't know, but I really hope that Israeli leadership gets its act together, unifies, gets all of the parties in Israeli politics that are Zionists and Israeli and want to live here safely and respectfully, get themselves together and focus on the most important thing, which isn't political sustainability, but it is winning the war, defending Israeli civilians, and making sure that Israelis can go back to their homes as they lived before October the 7th.
Jonathan Conricus, Lieutenant Colonel, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Coming in the studio.
Thank you.